Each time this dude gets a punch, this poor girl gets it too. There must be a strong connection between the two. When he finds out about it, he thinks perhaps he can use it and clap the girl from miles away. That's a great idea that hit the mind of our today's clap recap dude. He sure doesn't know yet that she has a husband. The movie starts with young Becky going sledding and a young Dylan in a classroom. While Becky begins her slide, it simultaneously affects Dylan. Becky loses control of her sled and hits her head on a tree, and Dylan is also affected and falls off of his chair, much to the concern of his classmates and teachers. We cut to the present day, and adult Dylan arrives at his trailer to find Giddens, his parole officer, waiting on him to do a routine check. Dylan tells him he's been doing well in his new job at the car wash. Giddens is suspicious and said he's waiting for Dylan to slip up and fall back into a life of crime. And he insists that Dylan should snitch on his old school buddies who he used to do crimes with. But Dylan ain't no snitch, and Giddens finally leaves. The scene moves to an adult Becky and her husband Philip, who is a doctor, where they're both getting ready to attend a party, and immediately we can tell Philip is a massive control freak, as he tells Becky what to do and even goes as far as questioning what she has on. We cut to a bar where Dylan's playing a game of pool and he decides to call it. His opponent isn't having it and tries to start a fight, but the fight is stopped by Dylan's friends, Bo and Lyle, who were the criminals referred to earlier. Bo takes Dylan to the bar and tells him about future illegal opportunities and says he'll be seeing him, and leaves. The bartender comes and warns Dylan that Giddens will throw him in jail if he continues to associate with Bo. Becky and Philip arrive at the party. Becky is not having a good time, and Philip is a tool when she tries to get a drink. Back at the bar, Dylan runs into an old lady friend, Donna. It's an awkward interaction, but she seems to like him. She leaves him to go meet up with another guy, and while Dylan watches her, he notices that his pool game opponent is still angrily staring at him. At the party, we see Becky, Phil, and a couple of other people chatting, and a lady suggests that Becky take up drawing, and while she's talking, Becky collapses on the floor like she was hit on the back. You guessed it, the dude from the bar had landed a hit on Dylan, and that transferred to Becky. Guess what happens if our Dylan has sex? Anyway, we'll get to that later. Back at the bar, the man's towering over Dylan as he screams, and Bo and Lyle grab him and drag him outside. Dylan gets up and decides to exit the bar, while back at the party, Rebecca is on the floor. As Dylan heads to his truck, he notices Bo and Lyle beating the crap out of the guy, and he tells him to stop. Dylan doesn't get in his car and decides to walk home. And then we see Becky and Phil driving home. Phil berates her a little for embarrassing him, but he calms down and comforts her as they head home. In the morning, Dylan wakes up and receives a phone call that he's late for work. He rushes out with his toothbrush and runs to his car, which he finds, and starts driving to work. Meanwhile, Becky goes to a clothing store to get some sweet lingerie. And as she is checking out a particular pair of panties, Dylan starts seeing the same pair of panties, which must have been weird. I mean, 1 minute you're thinking about getting to work, and then boom. Panties. You know, that actually happened to me this morning. I guess it's not that weird. Anyways, as you can imagine, Dylan starts to freak out, mostly because it's been a while since he saw a woman's panties, and Becky does too as she starts to notice the interior of Dylan's car. During the confusion, Dylan almost gets hit by a truck, and Becky sees it and starts to scream. He swerves and avoids the truck and starts swearing, which Becky hears, and they found out that they can hear each other, and they both start freaking out. Becky starts screaming and rushes out of the store, not even caring about the panties, which is a total dick move. Dylan stops his truck. Becky is frantic. Feeling she's losing her mind, they realize they can see what each other's seeing. They realize that they are not imagining this. Becky reveals that she is in New Hampshire while Dylan is in New Mexico. For a moment, Dylan thinks that she is from the future, but she disagrees and she says that she's in a different time zone. Not a smart guy, Dylan. They also find out that they can't read each other's thoughts, so that's a plus. Their conversation is cut short by a police officer checking up on Becky, and he escorts her to her car. Becky reconnects with Dylan and she explains that she knows how to cut him off and also that she can't be seen talking to herself in public. Good that Becky has the control button. Otherwise, it could end up a whole other story. Anyway, they decide to talk again at a later time. We see a quick shot of Michael at work and then Becky and her husband having dinner, and she tries to manipulate him into getting some alone time, and she succeeds. She steps into her home office and reconnects with Dylan, and they are both excited to start talking. Dylan asks her if she's Satan. She laughs and says no. They finally introduce themselves. When Dylan notices that she is rich and married, he is not so happy about it. Becky reveals that she hasn't told her husband about their connection. So they start getting acquainted, and they find out that they were both affected by the sledding accident at the beginning, which was wild. We cut to the next scene, and they are still getting to know each other. Dylan asks her about a time when she was 16 and how he kept feeling a lot of pain, and she tells him that that was the time she lost her virginity to a smash-and-run boyfriend. Poor Dylan got clapped without even knowing. Ugh. Dylan talks about his time in prison. Turns out he's very good at picking locks, and he got arrested for burglary. He then asks Becky to look in a mirror. She is hesitant but does so, and so does he. And they both finally find out what they look like. Apparently, if Dylan touches his own chest, she feels it on her body. Such a shame Dylan can't feel the same. The next scene involves Becky at a mechanic, and Dylan helps her from getting scammed out of $1,200 by fixing a minor issue in her Range Rover. Dylan meets up with Giddens for a check, and Giddens comments on his happy mood. And Dylan reveals that he met someone. Giddens smiles, but doubles down on his Dylan suspicion. Next, we cut to Dylan fixing his car and Becky at a coffee shop playing cards. The conversation is cut short when Bo and Lyle visit Dylan to tell him about a new job they got going on. It's to steal a bunch of equipment. Dylan refuses, and Bo threatens him a little, but they let him be. The scene shifts to Becky visiting Philip at his hospital, and she seems to be suffering from PTSD when she sees a hospital bed. Philip meets up with her, and she asks him to lunch. He's really busy and meets up with a Dr. Maynard who Becky doesn't like. Philip reminds her of an upcoming fundraiser. Becky leaves them behind, and then Philip and Maynard start talking about Becky like she's some kind of specimen being examined. Next, we see Dylan at a bar while talking to Becky, who is in bed. Dylan sees Donna and Becky and convinces him to ask her out in the hope that he can get her into bed, and they can all have a remote threesome. Dylan ends up in a cowardly fashion inviting her to his home for dinner, and she agrees, but it's fixed on the night of the fundraiser. On the night of the date and fundraiser, Becky is being flustered by a bunch of rich people, and she excuses herself to the ladies' room. Dylan, on the other hand, is a hot mess, trying to make dinner, and he even ends up wearing a bad shirt. The dude changes his shirt when he meets up with Donna at his door and immediately starts going wrong. The stakes are on fire. Donna prefers beer over wine, and the vibe isn't all that great. Meanwhile, Becky joins up with the aristocracy and immediately starts screaming. Turns out Dylan's sauce goes up in flames and she could see the whole thing. It is a hot mess, both at the party and on the date. Dylan goes to the bathroom to talk to Becky, and they have a little fight which resulted in him slapping himself. Donna sees him, she's freaked out, and she leaves. Becky fights with Phil, and they eventually calm down and do a little clapping. Awesome. After Becky's husband is done with clapping, Becky talks to Dylan, and he notices that she feels lighter. She reveals that she's been clapping. They talk for a while, and then they say goodnight. The scene cuts to Becky looking for old childhood photos, and as soon as they both start dancing, unknown to Dylan, his boss is watching him. Philly also finds Becky dancing, and when she finds out that she is looking for old photos, he tries to get her out of the room. Next, we see Dylan taking a piss, and then Becky starts talking to him. I think she liked what she saw because she kept smiling. I guess it's kinda girls' fetish to see men pee. Becky was heavily drunk and upset about the fact that Phil threw away her childhood photo album, which had pictures of her mom and dad, which she knew by heart. She also confessed about having mental health issues and being admitted to a mental institution, and how Phil nursed her back to health during that time, but the experience took away her sense of self. Dylan in turn started to talk about his family, his brother, his mom, and how he let them down. And that's when he started confessing his feelings for her and telling her how beautiful he finds her. Becky likes what she hears, and they both get hot and they end up doing some telepathic clapping. Safe for married women, and good for loners like Dylan. The scene cuts to Becky in a drawing class and talking to the owner who is at his job. Owen gets called to his boss's office and then he gets canned. Turns out customers don't like seeing a crazy person who talks to himself. At the drawing class, a concerned friend reaches out to Becky asking her what's wrong, and then misinterprets Becky's words by thinking she's having an affair, which we know she had. Dylan is back at the bar with Donna, he's playing pool and he's had a little too much to drink. Bo and Lyle meet up with him and they try to convince him to do the job. Dylan has a little bit of a psychotic episode and Bo and Lyle get angry and leave. We move to the hospital class where we find Becky's friend from the drawing class telling her husband that she is having an affair. He is incredibly distraught. Next, we see Becky visiting the snowy hill from the beginning of the movie. She and Dylan fight and they sort of break up and resolve to not connect anymore. Dylan is also distraught to the point that he even goes to check out the place Bo and Lyle were talking about. Next, we find him at the bar with Giddens, who starts coming down on him for his fight with Bo and Lyle. Dylan suddenly falls and he sees Becky being held by two large male nurses to a room. When he comes to, he decides to find Becky, much to the chagrin of Giddens. Next, we see Becky drugged up in a hospital bed and Philip serrating her. Dylan goes to sell his truck and holds the money. He runs into Bo and Lyle and they have a fight. He gets the best of them and steals Bo's car. Becky is still at the hospital. Dr. Maynard and Phil keep talking about Becky while the cops go looking for Dylan. Dylan gets on a plane. He manages to talk to Becky and he tells her that he's coming for her, and tells her not to take any more of the pills given to her. At the airport, Dylan tries to get a rented car, but he isn't given one because he doesn't have his license, so he ends up stealing another car. While Becky tries to get out of her room, Dylan teaches her how to pick a lock while she gives him directions. Such a great connection. Dylan tells her that when they get out, he wants them to move to Canada. Do all criminals go there? Anyway, Becky manages to pick the lock and navigate through the halls of the hospital. Dylan gets lost and runs into the cops when they start a car chase. He loses them in a muddy terrain, while Becky runs into Phil at the entrance of the hospital. She's scared and attempts to walk past him, and ends up punching him while being chased by more nurses. Meanwhile, Dylan ditches the vehicle and runs into the woods, and he tells Becky to do the same. They both hear a train and run for it. It takes a while, but they both arrive at the track and they try to get into the train. It's pretty difficult, and Becky doesn't make it, but Dylan grabs her and pulls her in. They're finally in the same space for the first time and are happy to see each other. Dylan says, "This is going to feel weird." Of course, imagine penetrating and feel like being penetrated as well. Kinda weirdly intense. And then they share a kiss, but we know the rest. Thanks for watching. Come back for more clapping.